At Thanksgiving dinner, my parents smirked. "We finally sold Grandma's house, you were never in the will." Anyway, my sister laughed. "Good, she'd just waste it." I took a sip of wine and said, "Cool. Hope you enjoy the cash, since I'm the one who bought it." The table went silent. Have you ever felt like the invisible child in your own family? Where are you listening to this story from? Please share your story in the comments. I really want to know how far my story will travel. Hi, my name is Madeline Harris, 32 years old, currently living in Chicago and working as an architect for a design firm that specializes in transforming old buildings into modern spaces. On the surface, my life may look stable and well put together, but behind that calm exterior lies a childhood and a family that always made me feel like an outsider. I am the middle child of 3 siblings. My older sister Victoria, who has always been praised as the model of success with her outstanding academic achievements, her brilliant career, and the radiant smile my parents never missed a chance to show off to relatives, and my youngest brother Ethan, who was never held accountable for his mistakes, always indulged with the excuse that he's still young, he needs time to grow up. In that family portrait, I was nothing more than a faint shadow caught between 2 extremes. Victoria, glowing in the spotlight, and Ethan, sheltered from every storm life could bring. From a very young age, I learned what it felt like to be abandoned in my own home. When I brought back a prize-winning drawing from school, my father only muttered a few distracted words before turning to listen to Victoria talk about making the honors class. When I wanted to share about the science project I was passionate about, my mother only gave a faint smile before rushing to comfort Ethan because he had just missed a goal in his school soccer game. It was always like that my parents' attention either revolved around Victoria or centered on Ethan. As for me, with my quiet nature and habit of keeping my feelings hidden, I gradually became the invisible child, the one whose presence or absence seemed to make no difference at all. If it weren't for my grandmother Eleanor, I might have grown up never knowing what real love felt like. She lived in Boston, in an old 2-story wooden house on a quiet street shaded by maples. That house always smelled of cinnamon and pumpkin when autumn came, and on late afternoons the golden light slanting through the windows would fall across the old piano where she liked to play simple, warm melodies. Grandma Eleanor was the only person who truly saw me, who listened when I spoke about my strange little dreams, and who praised me not for achievements but for effort and the way I observed the world. When the whole family gathered and I was overlooked, she would pull me close, lay a hand on my shoulder and whisper, "You notice the things others miss, Maddie. That is a gift, never forget it." Every summer I stayed with her. We would sit for hours on the porch, she in a creaking wicker chair while I leaned my head on a pillow and listened as she told stories of her youth, of a marriage that had ended, and of the years she raised my mother on her own. We tended the backyard garden together, where she planted sunflowers, the flowers, she said, always turn toward the light, just like you. She taught me how to bake pumpkin pie with a crisp crust and a gentle, sweet filling, and she taught me how to track expenses in a little notebook so I would never have to depend on anyone. For me, every moment with her was an affirmation that I mattered, that I deserved to be loved, even when my own family often made me feel like nothing more than a shadow. Now, years after leaving that house, whenever I remember, I can still vividly picture the smell of baking filling the kitchen, the old piano playing slightly offbeat but comforting notes, and those autumn afternoons when maple leaves covered the yard and she and I would giggle about trivial things. Eleanor's love was not only my most beautiful memory but also the only thread that kept me connected to a sense of belonging. In a family that always pushed me to the margins, she was the sole proof of my existence. And that love, up to this day, is the only thing that helps me believe my worth does not depend on recognition from my parents or siblings, but on the way I live honestly as myself. I remember the day I received the news of her passing clearly. I was in my final year at university in California, buried under a heavy schedule of graduation projects and part-time shifts to pay rent. The phone rang during a shift at the cafe near campus, and my mother's voice came through cold and dry. "Your grandmother passed away this morning. No words of comfort, no consolation." I froze, a tray of coffee still trembling in my hands, and felt a vast emptiness inside. All I could think about was getting back to Boston immediately, to see her one last time, to hold the hand that had gripped mine through childhood and hear her whisper, "Maddie, you are my pride." That very night I hunted for a plane ticket. The fares were steep because I was booking last minute, but I didn't care, I just needed to get home. I called my father and asked if the family could help with part of the cost, even a little, since my savings were exhausted after the last semester. He was silent for a few seconds, then said in a flat voice, "You're an adult now. If you really want to go, figure it out yourself. Don't bother us." I hung up with a heavy heart. A few hours later, I messaged my mother, hoping she would understand. She replied curtly, "We are all grieving. Don't be selfish and think only of yourself." I sank to the floor of my tiny apartment and the tears came. In that moment of loss, I realized I was completely alone. I forced myself to pick up extra shifts, hoping to scrape together enough money in a few days. But just as I found a cheaper ticket, my phone rang with a voicemail from my sister Victoria. "The funeral was this morning. You don't need to fly back, you'd only make things harder. Everyone is exhausted." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They had never told me the service had been moved up. They didn't want me there. They had taken away my last chance to say goodbye to the only person who had seen my worth. I sobbed until my throat tightened in that damp little room. There was no one there to hear me, no one to comfort me. For the first time, I truly felt the chill of being cast out by my own family. After the funeral, I called my mother, desperate for some explanation. She sighed and spoke with accusatory calm. "You're not in the will, Maddie. Your grandmother left the house to your father and me to keep things simple. You chose to leave and build your own career, so don't involve yourself in family matters." Those words cut through me like a blade. Not only had they stolen my chance to see her one last time, they had also removed me from any inheritance, as if my existence wasn't even worth considering. They said it as casually as if announcing the weather, without a shred of remorse or pity. I remember sitting for hours on that creaky little bed, hugging a pillow and staring at the mottled ceiling. I didn't cry anymore, my tears had run dry. What I felt was a vast emptiness and an undeniable truth. The only person who had ever made me feel seen was gone, and the rest of them no longer bothered to hide that they regarded me as a shadow. The wooden house where I once felt I belonged, the place where Eleanor and I had shared so many memories, was now declared to belong to my parents, and they treated me as if I had no claim. I was denied the chance to see her one last time, denied the right to keep anything that had belonged to her, denied any recognition in the will, everything erased, as if I had never been part of her life. In the days that followed, I tried to bury myself in schoolwork to numb the pain. When friends asked why I hadn't flown back, I forced a smile and said I was busy with exams. Inside, bitterness settled deep. I knew the truth. My family had chosen to erase me. All I had left were memories of her, her laughter, the smell of pumpkin pie, the offbeat melody of the piano, everything becoming the only inheritance I was allowed to keep. From that moment, I vowed to myself that I would stop expecting anything from my parents or my siblings. I would stand on my own and write my own story, because if I did not, I would remain an outsider in my own family forever. After graduation, I didn't return to Boston. Instead, I chose Chicago as the place to begin. The city was big enough for me to disappear into the crowd, far enough to escape my family's shadow, yet close enough that the memory of Eleanor never completely faded. I rented a small apartment in Lincoln Park, on the third floor of an old red brick building with windows overlooking a row of oak trees. At first, the apartment held only a few things: a second-hand sofa bought from a thrift store, a pine dining table with a chipped edge. But to me, it represented absolute freedom, the first time in my life. I had a space entirely my own, where I could choose the art on the walls and light whatever candles I wanted at night. My first job was at a small architecture office specializing in commercial renovations. The starting salary wasn't high, but I threw myself into the work with all the energy I had. I was often the one turning off the lights at night, adjusting every line on a drawing until it felt just right. In the evenings, I took on freelance projects online designing cafes, small shops. Every dollar I earned I managed carefully, paying rent, buying a proper desk chair, and saving the rest. Life wasn't glamorous, but I knew I was laying the foundation for something lasting. Those efforts slowly bore fruit. After 3 years, I was promoted to lead designer and began working on larger projects, renovating a shopping center, creating interiors for a restaurant chain. With more stable income, I built up real savings. I opened an investment account, learned to put money into index funds and small real estate ventures. In a strange way, being abandoned by my family had turned me into someone financially disciplined because I understood that no one but me would ever step in to take care of me. As my career advanced, my ties to my family grew increasingly faint. On my birthday, I would only receive a curt message, "Happy birthday." No gifts, no genuine check-ins. On holidays, they only remembered me when it was time to split the cost of an Airbnb. My presence was never considered necessary. I tried showing up sometimes, bringing small presents bought from my savings, but I was met with indifference. I remember one Christmas clearly. My father praised Victoria for a promotion, then turned to Ethan and, despite his lack of achievements, cooed, "Our son is doing great, he'll be successful." As for me, having just completed my first major project for the firm, I was given a perfunctory, "Is work okay?" And the conversation at the table immediately shifted. In that moment, I understood clearly I was a stranger in my own family. Even so, there was one thing I would never let go of, the memory of Grandma Eleanor and the wooden house in Boston. Late at night, when Chicago was quiet and the sound of the elevated trains drifted in the distance, I would close my eyes and imagine the creak of the floorboards beneath my feet, the faint scent of lavender in the air, and the lingering smell of apple pie coming from her kitchen. I remembered the old piano she would hesitate over while playing, and those autumn afternoons when we sat on the porch watching maple leaves fall. That house, with all its memories and warmth, was the last thread that connected me to my family, not because of them, but because of her. In my weakest moments, when work wore me down or loneliness hit, I would picture returning to that house, pushing open the heavy wooden door and hearing her soft laugh of welcome. That house was more than a place to me. It was a symbol of real love and the only recognition I had ever received. It reminded me that even if my parents and siblings treated me like a shadow, there had been someone who truly saw me, and she left behind a legacy no one could deny. And it was that memory that kept me standing. I learned to accept the distance from my family and no longer demanded recognition from them. I poured myself into my work, into the friends who became my true family, and into a future I was determined to build with my own hands. Yet deep down, I knew that one day that final thread would pull me back, forcing me to face the truth my family had tried so hard to bury. And when that day came, I would no longer be the silent girl who accepted everything. One October afternoon, as I sat working in my Chicago office, my phone buzzed. A message appeared from an old friend in Boston, someone I hadn't spoken to in years. Just a few words. "Maddie, I just drove past your old street. Your grandma's house has a for sale sign." I read the text over and over, my heart pounding. In an instant, I could see the familiar wooden house, the autumn porch, the scent of lavender and baking from my childhood sharper than if it had happened yesterday. Just a single line of text, and my entire world shifted. I opened my laptop immediately, typed the address into a real estate site, and there it was, a photo of Eleanor's house, now looking weary, its paint peeling, the wooden door half shut, and a for sale sign planted in the yard. My throat tightened. I called my mother. When she picked up, her voice was light, almost relieved, as if nothing serious was at stake. "Oh, Maddie. How are you?" "Yes, we decided to sell Mom's house. It was about time, really. You never cared about it anyway. Besides, it's just a burden." I went numb. "You never cared." The words cut into me like a cold knife. Every fiber of my being wanted to scream that I did care, that the house was the only place where I had ever felt loved, but I said nothing. I simply went silent, muttered, "I understand," and hung up. That night, I sat alone in my small apartment in Chicago, the warm yellow light spilling across the empty kitchen table. I set my phone down and stared into nothing. My mother's words echoed in my head. "It's just a burden." The house that held my memories, my grandmother, the summers filled with sunlight and the smell of pumpkin pie was nothing more to them than a heavy object to discard. For the first time, something inside me shifted. I didn't just feel pain or disappointment as before. This time, I saw a truth clearly. If I kept silent, I would always be pushed aside. And I had been silent for far too long. A thought struck me. I wouldn't argue, I wouldn't beg, I wouldn't plead for them to acknowledge my worth. I had tried all of that through my childhood, and it had never been returned. Instead, I would take control. I opened my laptop and looked up the brokerage name written on the sign in the photo. I sent an email, but not under my real name. I signed it as M. Bennett, my grandmother's last name, distant enough to hide me from my family, close enough to make me feel she was standing beside me. In the message, I introduced myself as a real estate investor with an interest in historic homes in Boston. Just a few days later, the agent replied, inviting me to schedule a showing. I booked a plane ticket and packed a single small suitcase. On the day of the flight, standing at the airport as people hurried past, I knew I was taking a risk. But never had I felt such clarity inside. I was not returning as the invisible daughter anymore. I was going back as an adult, ready to write the next chapter of my own story. As soon as I stepped out of the taxi and saw the house from a distance, my chest tightened. It looked even older than in the photos, paint peeling, the porch layered with dust, the sunflower garden my grandmother once tended reduced to broken, withered stalks. I climbed the wooden steps, each creak under my feet making me feel as if I could see her again, sitting in her wicker chair, smiling gently. I drew a deep breath, swallowing back the tears rising in my throat, and walked inside with the agent. The moment I crossed the threshold, my whole body trembled. The familiar space washed over me like a wave of memory. I saw the faded wallpaper peeling from the walls, but in my mind's eye I remembered the beige floral pattern my grandmother had once put up alone during a freezing winter. I heard the creak of the floorboards beneath me, instantly recalling the sound every time I had run to find her in the kitchen. The faint scent of lavender lingered in the air, even though the house had been empty for years. My heart clenched, my eyes stung. I turned away, pretending to examine the room like a detached investor, while my vision blurred with tears I could barely hold back. I paused in the living room, where my grandmother's old piano still stood. The keys were covered in dust, many yellowed with age, yet in my ears I could hear the wavering melodies of the past, when she taught me my very first notes. I laid my hand gently on the lid, whispering with a trembling voice, "Grandma, I'm home." The agent kept talking enthusiastically about renovation potential, about the rising value of the neighborhood, but I only half listened. In my mind, a decision had already been made. I would buy this house, no matter the cost. When the showing ended, I stepped out onto the porch and breathed in the crisp Boston air. I realized clearly that if I hesitated, they would sell it to someone else. I could not let my grandmother's legacy vanish into strangers' hands. So as soon as I returned to the hotel, I began the paperwork. The shell company I had set up months earlier, Bennett Holdings LLC, served as the official buyer. The documents were signed quickly because I did not haggle and I showed no emotion. I paid the asking price, straightforwardly, which pleased the agent and sped the process along. When the transfer was complete, I sat alone in the hotel room with the stack of ownership papers on the table. The new owner listed under the name Bennett was me. I cried, not from triumph, but from the feeling of finally reclaiming what belonged to me and, more truly, to her. I knew she would be proud that I had not abandoned the house or our memories. But I also knew it was not yet time to reveal the truth. My parents, Victoria, and Ethan still thought they had sold the house and gotten rid of the burden. I decided to remain silent and wait. Thanksgiving was coming, and I was certain they would gather and boast about finally sorting out the house. I pictured my mother's mocking smile, Victoria's haughty laugh, and Ethan's likely jokes. This time I would not be silent. I would sit there, raise a glass, and calmly say, "I hope you enjoy the money, because the buyer is me." I wanted that moment to land as a true surprise, to leave them stunned, so that for the first time in their lives they would face the fact that I was no longer a shadow they could dismiss. That Thanksgiving evening, I walked into my parents' house like a stranger invited in. Their suburban Boston home was dressed to impress. Autumn wreaths hung on the door, scented candles filled the living room with the smell of vanilla and cinnamon. The long dining table was covered with a cream-colored cloth, a golden roasted turkey placed at the center, flanked by bowls of mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce, and bottles of red wine already uncorked. The room buzzed with noise and laughter, a picture-perfect family gathering one I had never truly belonged to. Victoria sat at the head of the table, in a dark blue dress that hugged her figure, her hair styled in flawless waves as if she had just stepped out of a photo shoot. She held court, going on and on about her new position at a prestigious New York law firm, her voice brimming with pride. "The firm really values my expertise. I'll be managing an entire group of international clients. The pressure is intense, but it's such an opportunity." My parents nodded eagerly, their faces glowing with pride. "Our brilliant daughter," my mother beamed, "such a pride of the family." I sat quietly, offering a faint smile and sipping my wine. No one thought to ask how I was doing. Then it was Ethan's turn, my youngest brother, launching into a boast about his new startup project. In reality, it was his fourth attempt in 3 years, each one ending in failure. Yet my parents gazed at him as if he were some undiscovered genius. "It's a brilliant idea," my father said, clapping him on the shoulder. "Risk is just the stepping stone to success. Go ahead and try, you've got us backing you." I couldn't help but laugh inwardly. I remembered when I once dreamed of starting something of my own. All I ever heard was, "You should take the safe route. Don't waste time on fantasies." The table filled with laughter and the clinking of glasses. I stayed silent, observing every face, every familiar gesture. That lively scene felt to me like a staged performance, where I was only a spectator, never given a role to play. I had prepared myself for this moment, so I waited patiently, nodding when Victoria bragged, smiling faintly when Ethan was praised, as if I were still the dutiful, quiet, invisible Maddie. Then came dessert. My mother carried out a large pumpkin pie, thick whipped cream spread generously across the top. She set it down at the center of the table, her eyes gleaming with a secret. I recognized the moment instantly, the one where they would drop their big news. Sure enough, she took a sip of wine, glanced around the table with a triumphant smile, and said, drawing out her words for effect, "Oh, I almost forgot to mention, we finally sold Mom's house. At last, we're free of that burden. And Maddie, you weren't in the will anyway, so really, why would you care?" The clinking of silverware stopped midair. I felt every eye flick toward me, waiting for a reaction. My heart pounded, but my face remained composed. I swirled my glass lightly, watching the red wine shimmer under the candlelight. Victoria let out a sharp, mocking laugh, twisting the knife. "Good," she said. "Even if Maddie had the house, she'd just waste it. I'm honestly glad it's been sold." Ethan chuckled lazily, pouring himself more wine, muttering under his breath. "Yeah, lucky it's gone. If she'd kept it, she'd probably turn it into some hermit's hideout." I quietly raised my glass and took a sip. The bitterness spread across my tongue, but it brought with it a strange calm. Setting the glass down, I slowly lifted my head, locking eyes with my parents before glancing at Victoria. I let the silence stretch just long enough for it to sting, for the ticking of the wall clock to echo through the room that was growing still. Then I spoke, my voice soft but sharp, each word cutting through the air like a thin blade. "I hope you're enjoying the money, because the buyer was me." The room dropped into absolute silence. My mother's smile froze, her eyes widening as the spoon slipped from her hand and clattered against her plate. Victoria snapped upright, her face flushing red with a mix of shock and fury. My father frowned deeply, trying to process what I had just said. Ethan blinked over and over, as though working out an equation too complicated for his drunken mind. No one spoke. I looked around the table and saw, for the first time in my life, every gaze fixed on me, not to mock, not to dismiss, but because they had never seen it coming. I lifted my glass again, swirling it once more before offering a faint smile. Yes, I continued. I was the one who bought Grandma's house. Through my own company. Not with anyone's help, not with borrowed money. I did it because I wanted to preserve her legacy, not for the money. I paused, letting my words settle into the tension that filled the room. No one had anything to say in return, at least not in that moment. The room, once full of laughter, now carried only the sound of heavy breathing and the faint clatter of silverware against plates. Thanksgiving night ended under a cloud so heavy I could hear the wind whistling outside the window more clearly than the people inside. There were no parting hugs, no warm holiday wishes like in years past. I left in awkward silence, while my parents, Victoria, and Ethan sat around the cold, lifeless table. I knew the storm wasn't over. And just as I expected, the next morning my phone buzzed, non-stop, flooded with messages. The first came from my mother. You humiliated this family in front of everyone. Do you even realize how selfish you are? Your father and I took care of that house for years, and you swoop in just to ruin everything. Next was a message from my father, his words colder but brimming with anger. You exploited a loophole to buy the house at a low price. That's not the act of a considerate daughter, you've only driven this family further apart. Then came Victoria, as sharp and cutting as ever. You think you won, don't you? All you did was take revenge. If Grandma were alive, she'd be disappointed that you turned her legacy into some stunt to prove yourself. I read each message without replying. Their accusations weren't surprising, but each one sliced into old wounds, the ones that had been there since I was a child, sitting quietly at the edge of the table, forgotten in the middle of their family stories. Ethan was different. His message carried a softer tone. Maddie, I know things got a little out of hand last night. Mom and Vic just lost their tempers. Honestly, I think it's good the house ended up with you, at least it stays in the family. Let's talk, okay? No need to let this get worse. He even called, his voice slurred with drink but edged with guilt. I didn't know they'd say all that. I just want everyone to get along. I answered with a few short words before hanging up. For the rest of the week, my phone felt like a battlefield. On one side were the accusations and blame from my parents and Victoria. On the other were Ethan's messages, pleading for peace. I remained silent, offering no defense, no reaction. Yet inside me, a doubt grew larger and larger, spreading like a crack in glass. Why would Grandma Eleanor, the woman who had held my hand so many times and whispered, "One day, this house will be yours," be written out of my parents' version of her will? I thought back to the afternoons on the porch, her gentle smile as she told me this house carried the soul of the family, and that she believed I was the only one who would truly cherish it. Words like that weren't vague or careless. So why, after her passing, did my parents boldly claim I wasn't mentioned at all? Why was the funeral moved up without warning, leaving me no chance to return? Why was every detail of the inheritance delivered only through their voices, with not a single official document shown to me? Those questions swirled in my head and stole my sleep for many nights. I sat in my Chicago apartment, opened my laptop, and combed through every old email, every scrap of paper my grandmother had ever sent, hoping to find a clue. I even dug out the birthday cards she had written by hand, her round handwriting sometimes leaning slightly to the right. In one of them, I found a line she had written. Maddie, always believe you deserve what you cultivate. This house, no matter what, is yours. Reading it made my eyes blur. I knew she never spoke without meaning. The more I thought about it, the more certain I became that something had been hidden. Perhaps my parents had concealed an alternate version of the will, or deliberately handled the paperwork in a way that benefited them. The thought enraged and propelled me at the same time. I could not let the truth lie buried under a layer of deceit any longer. One evening, I sat alone by the window watching the city lights blink like distant, unfamiliar eyes. I sipped bitter coffee and told myself it was time. I would no longer be the silent, resigned Maddie. I would be the Maddie my grandmother believed in, the one she trusted, and I would stand up to reclaim the truth. I began to make a plan. First, I would contact the probate office in Boston where wills were archived. If my name had ever been included, there had to be a trace. I would also try to find my grandmother's former attorney if he was still alive or still practicing. I would review the property records, the date of transfer, the method of signing. Every fragment of information would be a piece of the puzzle I needed to reassemble the full picture. That night, I opened the old leather notebook Grandma's gift to me when I entered college and began listing every step. The first words I wrote were, "Find the truth." I didn't know where the journey would lead, whether into a legal battle or a painful confrontation. But I knew one thing. I owed it to Eleanor, and I owed it to myself, to uncover the truth. On a Monday morning, I requested half a day off from work and caught the earliest flight from Chicago to Boston. In my hands, I carried a folder of personal documents, a long checklist of tasks, and a determination that left no room to turn back. Ever since my mother had accused me of being selfish, one question had echoed in my mind. If Eleanor once promised the house was mine, how could they dare say I was never named in her will? I needed proof, not words. My first stop was the probate office where my grandmother had filed documents years earlier. It was a modest red brick building near the city center, with worn but tidy carpet lining the hallways. I took a deep breath and stepped inside, steadying my voice as I explained to the receptionist that I wanted to review records connected to the will of my grandmother, Eleanor Bennett. The middle-aged woman behind the desk handed me a form, her tone indifferent, as if this were nothing more than routine. I filled in the name and the date of her passing, then handed it back. Half an hour later, a file was brought out. My heart pounded as the clerk flipped through the pages until she stopped at a will dated just a few weeks before my grandmother's death. The slanted, familiar handwriting appeared before my eyes. I, Eleanor Bennett, leave the house on Maple Street, along with all its contents, to my granddaughter, Madeline Harris. Because she is the only one who has always cherished this home and will preserve it. I read the line 3 times, my vision blurring with tears. All the memories came rushing back, those afternoons when she held my hand on the porch, her whispers that, "The house will be yours." She had written it down, not just said it aloud. And then I turned to the accompanying documents. The truth froze me in place. Alongside that will was an older version, drafted years earlier, in which the house was left to my daughter Margaret Harris and her husband. That older version was the one my parents had submitted to the court. Shaking, I managed to ask the clerk, "Is there any record that this most recent will was used in the probate process?" She shook her head and answered flatly, "No. The only document submitted was the older version. This one was never brought forward." I walked out of the probate office with my legs barely steady beneath me. But I didn't stop. I headed straight to the county courthouse, the place that handled inheritance cases. After filing a request for records, I was handed a copy of my family's probate file. Just as I had suspected, my parents had submitted the old will, along with a deed transfer bearing Eleanor's signature, one that had been notarized fraudulently. I stared at the signature on the page, the shaky, uneven strokes, nothing like the graceful handwriting I knew so well. Heat rose to my face. My entire body trembled, not only with anger but with the raw shock of betrayal. My parents, the people who were supposed to protect and guide me, had stolen the inheritance my grandmother left me, lied that I was never in the will, and forged documents to bury the truth. I remembered the funeral, how they had deliberately changed the time so I wouldn't make it. Now the entire picture was complete. They had wanted me erased from the beginning, as though I had never been part of the family. I left the courthouse in a daze. The Boston sky that day was a dull gray, the wind biting cold, but none of it compared to the frost twisting inside me. I sat on the stone steps outside, watching people pass by as if the world had just collapsed. For years I had convinced myself I was merely overlooked, just less favored. But the truth was far darker. They had intentionally cut me out of everything, using calculated deceit. I drew a deep breath, wiped my tears, and pulled out my phone. I dialed the number of a law firm specializing in estate disputes, one I had already researched. When a steady baritone answered, "Good afternoon, Mitchell and Gray Law Offices. How can I help you?" I knew I had crossed a line I could never step back from. My voice came out hoarse but determined as I said, "I need an appointment. I've just uncovered proof that my parents submitted the wrong will and may have forged transfer documents. I want to file a lawsuit. I die. The line went silent for a moment before the lawyer replied. "Miss Harris, if what you're saying is true, this isn't just a civil dispute, this is fraud. Come to our office, bring all the documents. We'll start from there." I hung up, my heart still racing, not from shock this time, but from a surge of new energy. Determination. If my parents believed I would always be the obedient, silent daughter who let them do whatever they pleased, they were wrong. I would face them. I would fight, not only for myself, but for the truth and for Eleanor. I arrived at the offices of Mitchell and Gray on a cold weekend morning. Boston lay draped in fog, the red brick streets damp with the remnants of last night's rain. My lead attorney, Richard Mitchell, was a man in his early 50s, trim and steady, his voice carrying the weight of certainty. He flipped through the documents I had brought. The copy of my grandmother's most recent will, the probate records my parents had submitted, and the fraudulent transfer deed with the trembling signature. Looking at me over silver-rimmed glasses, his gaze was stern but resolute. "Miss Harris, this is a clear case of estate fraud. Your parents deliberately concealed the valid will and used an outdated one, supported by falsified documents. This isn't just a civil violation, it borders on criminal conduct. But first, we'll file a civil suit to restore your rightful inheritance." Hearing those words, my chest tightened and loosened all at once. At last, the truth I had suspected for so long now had a legal voice to confirm it. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into gathering evidence. Richard guided me carefully. "We need testimony from anyone who can confirm that Eleanor expressed her wish to leave the house to you. The more witnesses, the better. We also have to find people who were in contact with her during the time she wrote the new will, neighbors, church friends, even her accountant." I began with the familiar faces on Maple Street. Mrs. Valente, the neighbor next door, remembered clearly. "There were many times Eleanor told me you were the only one who sat with her, listened to her stories, helped in the garden. She said this house would go to you in the end. I can write a statement if needed." Her words brought tears to my eyes, and I gripped her hand tightly in thanks. Next, I went to the church where my grandmother had sung in the choir. The elderly pastor, Mr. Hamilton, recalled vividly. Eleanor often confided that she worried her family wouldn't respect her wishes. "She told me she had updated her will, leaving the house to you." "I'll gladly confirm that." Another close friend from the women's group at church added, "She was so proud of you, Maddie. She always said you were the only one who truly saw and understood her." Each of these testimonies felt like pieces of a puzzle, fitting back together the picture my parents had tried so hard to tear apart. Most important of all was the word of her former accountant, Mr. Wallace. It took me nearly a week to track him down. He was now retired and living in the suburbs. When I finally reached him, he recalled immediately. "I worked with Eleanor for many years. In the last month before she passed, she sent me a note by email, listing that the house was to go to you. I still have a copy in my archives." When he printed out that email and handed it to me, my hands trembled. The proof was undeniable, a dated document, stored on record, something no one could refute. As the legal process slowly took shape, I began another journey, restoring the house. Every weekend, I flew back to Boston, bundled in a heavy coat, rolling up my sleeves to work alongside the roofers. We replaced the crumbling shingles, reinforced the wooden frame with hidden steel supports to preserve the original structure. I walked through the backyard, pulling up weeds that had overtaken the soil, and planted sunflower seeds, my grandmother Eleanor's favorite flower, the one she told me always finds the light, no matter which way it faces. Each time I pressed a seed into the earth, I felt a little more healed, as though she were whispering encouragement to keep going. The house slowly came back to life. The smell of new wood mingled with the lavender sachets I had found tucked away in her drawer. The living room was painted a soft beige, and I left the old piano in place as a symbol. I wiped each key carefully, then pressed one lightly. The sound still rang out, warped but alive, like a voice from the past. I promised myself I would have it restored, so that one day the melodies she used to play would echo through the room again. Standing in the garden, watching the sunflower sprouts push up through damp soil, I felt deeply that this place was more than property, it was a sanctuary of healing. After years of living in the shadow of my family, I had finally found a space that belonged solely to me, a place where I could breathe, rebuild, and gather strength. The house became proof that I was no longer the abandoned child, but a woman capable of building, protecting, and affirming her own worth. One late evening, after finishing the day's cleaning, I sat on the front porch with a cup of hot tea in my hand. The autumn wind rustled through the maple trees, scattering yellow leaves across the steps. I opened the leather notebook my grandmother had once given me and wrote a new line. Next step, file the lawsuit. I knew the road ahead would be full of storms. My family would resist, smear me, perhaps even rally relatives to their side. But for the first time in my life, I felt armed with truth, with evidence, and with a home no one could deny. When the day of the trial arrived, Boston seemed wrapped in an invisible shroud of tension. I walked into the county courthouse, my palms icy despite clutching the file tightly. The courtroom glowed under fluorescent lights, rows of wooden benches lined up neatly, and at the front stood the imposing bench of the judge. I sat beside my attorney, Richard Mitchell, while my parents and Victoria sat opposite with their lawyer. Ethan was absent, something that left me both saddened and strangely relieved. As the session began, the judge, a silver-haired woman with black-rimmed glasses, called for order. My parents' lawyer, a sleek man with a polished voice, opened the defense. Your Honor, this is not fraud, it was simply a misunderstanding during a time of grief. Mr. and Mrs. Harris believed the older will was the final one, and to avoid unnecessary complications, they chose the simpler route. He lingered on the words misunderstanding and simpler as though clinging to a lifeline. My parents sat there with carefully arranged grief on their faces. My mother dabbed at her eyes and whispered, "We only wanted to move things along so no one would suffer more." Maddie was so young then we didn't think she'd want to take on an old house. Victoria folded her arms, her cold gaze flicking toward me as if to send the message that I was disrupting the greater good. Richard, seated beside me, tapped his pen lightly against the table before standing. His voice was low but carried clearly. Your Honor, the plaintiff has irrefutable evidence that this was not a misunderstanding but a deliberate concealment. He opened his case file and began to present the exhibits. First came Eleanor's most recent will, signed and dated just weeks before her death. The judge took the copy, skimmed it, and gave a slight nod. Richard continued. This will plainly leaves the Maple Street house to Miss Madeline Harris. The defendants, however, intentionally withheld this document and submitted an older one under which the house would pass to them. They not only ignored the valid will, they also supplemented it with an unlawful deed transfer. Next he called the notary Miss Diana to the stand. The middle-aged woman stepped up and spoke with certainty. The signature on the transfer deed is not mine. I did not notarize any document related to Miss Eleanor on that date. My notary log confirms I was not working that day. A murmur swept through the courtroom, the judge furrowed her brow and glanced toward my parents. Richard was not finished. He produced the email from the accountant, Wallace, in which Eleanor stated plainly, I have updated my will, the house will go to my granddaughter Maddie. Mr. Wallace was present as well to confirm he had received that email just 1 week before her passing. The final blow was the handwritten letter discovered tucked inside my grandmother's journal. Richard read it aloud, his voice steady but weighted with emotion. Maddie, if you are reading these lines, it means I am no longer here. I want you to know this house is yours. You are the only one who truly loves it. Don't let anyone make you believe you are unworthy. The courtroom fell utterly silent. I could hear my heartbeat pounding as the familiar words rang out in the most public place imaginable, my eyes stinging with tears. The opposing attorney tried to interject, his tone urgent. It's possible Eleanor was confused, perhaps that will wasn't formally validated. But the judge raised a hand, cutting him off. Enough. The evidence is clear. This was not a mistake. This was intentional. The room sank into heavy silence. I looked at my parents. My father's head was bowed, his jaw clenched tight. My mother's face had gone pale, her hands trembling. Victoria bit her lip, her eyes burning with fury as if she could tear me apart with a glance, but she had no words left to throw. At last, the judge delivered her ruling. The valid will is the document dated October 14, which leaves the house to Miss Madeline Harris. The prior will and the transfer deed are void. Mr. and Mrs. Harris are to be sanctioned for fraudulent conduct and are ordered to cover legal costs and damages. Her voice was firm, leaving no room for doubt. I sat there without cheering, without breaking into tears, only exhaling softly as though laying down a weight I had carried for years. This was not a victory to celebrate but the confirmation of truth. I didn't need to shout for justice. All I had needed was evidence, patience, and the voice of Eleanor, the only person who had ever believed in me. When the hearing ended, I slowly gathered my papers. My parents and Victoria walked out in silence, not once glancing my way. I didn't call after them either. Between us, the distance had grown too vast, the fracture too deep. But for the first time in my life, I no longer felt like the invisible child. I had stood up, defended what was mine, and I had prevailed with a quiet, defiant pride. In the weeks that followed, the aftershocks spread faster than I expected. In a town like Boston, where neighbors and colleagues are inevitably connected, an inheritance fraud could not stay hidden. Within just a few weeks of the ruling, my parents lost nearly all credibility. My mother, once a fixture on the church's parent council and praised as a model woman, now drew whispers at every Sunday service. People stopped greeting her. Some even changed their path to avoid crossing her. My father, long accustomed to wearing the mask of respectability, fell into silence, no longer boasting about business ventures. A former real estate partner cut ties altogether, citing plainly, "We do not wish to be associated with a legal scandal." Victoria took the hardest hit. The law firm where she worked, a place that prized its reputation above all, could not turn a blind eye. Just a week after the headline, "Harris family involved in will fraud," ran in the local news, she was placed on suspension. I heard through an old friend that she lashed out, insisting, "This is all Maddie's fault." But the truth was undeniable. No one had forced them to forge documents, and no one had made them mock me at Thanksgiving dinner. The price they paid was the direct result of choices they thought would never be discovered. Ethan was the only one who stirred a flicker of pity in me. He had never truly grown up, always shielded by our parents. After the trial, he sent me a short message. "Maddie, I'm sorry. I never thought it would be this serious. I'm ashamed I didn't do anything to stop them." I read his words many times but, in the end, didn't reply. Not out of hatred, but because I had chosen another path, to cut ties completely. I blocked the family group chat, deleted their contacts, and let go of the haunting hope that one day they might change. I knew now they never would. And my healing would never come from waiting for their regret, but from my own courage to walk away. Instead of turning my back on the past, I chose to transform it. Eleanor's house became more than a personal inheritance, it became a gift to the community. For months I poured myself into renovations, preserving the spirit of the home while shaping it into a place where others could also find peace. The spacious living room was reimagined as a cozy reading room, with shelves filled with the novels my grandmother had loved. Her old piano was sent away for restoration and returned to stand proudly in the corner, where sometimes I pressed a few keys, letting the sound carry me back to childhood. The backyard blossomed into a radiant sunflower garden. I planted them row by row, so that when summer came the entire yard glowed golden, a sea of light stretching toward the sky. Neighbors began to stop by. Some brought stories of Eleanor, Others simply wanted a quiet corner to read. One afternoon, Mrs. Valente, the old neighbor, arrived with an apple pie and said, "Your grandmother would be so proud, Maddie. The house has truly come alive again." It was in that moment that the idea for the Eleanor Foundation was born. I wanted to transform my painful experience into hope for others. The foundation would focus on helping people who had been stripped of their inheritance by their own families, giving them access to legal support and a way to preserve their homes as living memory. I used the damages awarded in court, along with my savings, to launch it. To my surprise, the project quickly gained support from the community. A local newspaper wrote, "From a family lawsuit, one woman turns her pain into a mission to help others preserve their memories." Oh! In the months that followed, my grandmother's house became a gathering place for small community events, workshops on writing clear wills, a book club, even meetings where people shared their family stories. I stood among them, listening to others who had once been the forgotten child tell their journeys, and realized I was not alone. Each person carried a wound, but connection transformed that pain into strength. 1 year later, on an autumn evening, I sat on the porch where Eleanor once rested in her old wicker chair, tea in hand, eyes lifted to the falling maple leaves. I turned on the porch light. Its warm glow spilled outward, pushing back the darkness that cloaked the street. And softly, as if speaking into the wind, I whispered, "I have found my worth again, and I no longer need recognition from anyone." Ah! In that moment, I felt her presence somewhere close, smiling gently, as if she had witnessed the journey I had walked. And for the first time, I felt truly free. No more chains, no more waiting, only me and the new life opening ahead. Perhaps many of you listening to this story will see a reflection of your own life in it. Maybe you were compared to your siblings. Maybe you were pushed aside from important decisions. Maybe you were treated as the invisible child. I want you to know this. You are not alone. You have the right to set boundaries. You have the right to choose self-love, even when your own family cannot give it to you. Remember, healing does not come from watching them fall. It comes from the decisive choice to cut the ties, to choose yourself. When you stop waiting for praise or recognition, you will discover just how sweet true freedom can be.